Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kyri Chrisandreas. I'm Senior Business Consultant at amasol, and today I will be talking to you about the importance of cross-transparency across the business and a particular framework that you can use to be successful. So IT spending usually flies under the radar. It's very unnoticed, gets very low priority. And at the end of the day, technology is very much integral to the business. So spending is susceptible to changes and forces within the business. IT spending is always continuing upwards, especially now during post-pandemic. And it's now very much important that a company has a cost base that is transparent across the whole of the organization. Failure to align their IT with the business will eventually kill the investment in that technology. And when we think about a business, we have IT, finance, and the CEO needing to work together to ensure alignment across the whole of the business. So if we look at a recent survey from last year, just before the pandemic, CEOs were asked about their business strategy, and they were given areas of drivers that would be in the future. And quite clearly here we can see that CIOs and tech leaders make up 40% of their key drivers for business strategy. Now that's been brought forward by the pandemic, so this number has actually increased further and will continue to increase as more people work from home and more companies go online. So at the moment we can see there's a massive gap, and there's a gap between the IT costs that are basically overheads, the transparency to the business, how much finance charges for some of the consumption of that IT, and IT costs to business units will remain unclear. So we need to link activities and business together, which is quite a complex situation, and quite often some of these costs are very much indirect. So if we think about how we can do that, there is a technology business management, which is an area that covers similar to manufacturing, finance, and sales. So they have their own systems, ERP systems, CPM systems, CRM systems, but it seems like IT don't really have their own system that they can use to cost out the services, the infrastructure that they provide. So one of the tools with it that we can use is the TBM Taxonomy. So we can classify all of the costs within our IT area and align them to the business. So we need to be talking to the business with the same framework that they understand. So something that is non-technical, something that works across industries and geographies, and something we can use later to perhaps benchmark our business against another business, perhaps of the same size or in the same industry. So it's quite clear that we need some sort of taxonomy to group everything together and to provide consistency throughout the whole organization. So a standardized taxonomy will show how we can do that. And the TBM Council have put together a taxonomy that I'll show you in a minute that can classify operational data against assets, applications, labor, and align those to how finance communicate with the rest of IT as well. So if we look at the TBM taxonomy, we can see here that there are 3 views down the right-hand side. There's the business view, the IT view, and the finance view. And then we have classifications with each of these boxes. So these are classifications that everyone understands. Finance understand how much labor costs, hardware costs, software costs. IT understand delivering applications, security, IT management. These are all buckets that we can put costs into, and then we can push those up to the business, and the business can then identify costs aligned to digital platforms, product lines, perhaps business processes, perhaps business units that generate revenue or don't generate revenue. So this taxonomy will align everything together through CFO, CIO, and CEO. So if we think of this in terms of structure of flow of cost, we start with our cost source. So finance will provide the cost source. We will track projects, labor, vendor costs. Those will be aligned to our infrastructure costs. So we will know what type of infrastructure we have, whether we have a database, licensing costs for databases, whether we own data centers, whether we own servers, and the applications that run on those. And those applications will be aligned to business services that we provide for the business. So now we can see this flow from the bottom to the top. So if our cost at the bottom is 1 million, then we expect to charge back to the business unit 1 million. Remember that this is an internal cost. So we're not trying to make a profit. It's just taking the cost from that cost source and pushing it against the business units to internally charge. Perhaps we would do that initially via showback, and then perhaps later on we would start raising invoices and doing it against chargeback. Now this will change behavior because there will be certain applications and services that people don't use. So we can see that it's very important and central to the business that we must align everything together. So shifting from a cost center to a value driver. We need to use TBM in aligning the CIO, the CFO, and the CEO. There needs to be an agreement across all levels that everyone's talking the same language, and then there can be a clear alignment between finance, IT, and business. So quite often we hear this phrase, the CIO says, we want to be a cost leader. But to be a cost leader, you must understand your costs. They must be transparent. They must be aligned with strategy. So using a TBM taxonomy would allow you to align not only your costs, your infrastructure, and your services, and you can become a cost leader. And if you're benchmarking against other organizations, then you can clearly define whether you've reached that cost leader status or not. So if we take a use case, a financial payment system, it wants to create a chargeback model. The issue at the beginning of the project was that the business and IT were struggling, causing frustration. They couldn't identify costs. They didn't know the impact of costs, and they couldn't explain where costs were actually ending up. So using a TBM taxonomy, the guiding principle to structure their service catalog, align the infrastructure with those services, and align the costs with the infrastructure, they can then build and allow everyone to talk the same language and cost out services that are supported by the business. So if we take another use case, there are 4 stages to our use cases. So we have the observation, the data, the analysis, and the action. So first of all, we need to understand what it is we're trying to achieve. Perhaps if we take one of these arguments, licensing, we notice that the software licensing is expensive and in some cases not used. So the data we collect would be to gain active users, software licenses, look at account login details to see if people are logging in and using that software. We can total those up, produce activity logs, and the action we take is to sunset some systems, review or renegotiate current licenses. Perhaps we don't need as many as we should. So there's an example of flowing through the TBM taxonomy, going from observation to action. And one of these may seem like a small increment, but when you're doing across the whole of the infrastructure, this then becomes quite powerful. So what systems could we use to do this kind of measuring, collecting the data, etc.? We could use spreadsheets, but they're not very good for complex modeling. They're prone to error. People pass them around. You don't have the latest copy. They're not all in one place. We could use ERP systems, but they're really geared around invoicing and providing general ledger. So therefore, they're not really designed to build around the infrastructure and identify infrastructure. Or we could use a CPM system, but again, that's looking at the core business, products and services that are being delivered, and that can sometimes not account for the IT infrastructure that we need to model within our tool. So if we do think about tools that we could use, there are several tools that we call Pureplay solutions. So we have Aptio, we have Serviceware, and we have Nycus software. They're clearly designed for using the TBM taxonomy and used by the IT function. There are other tools, but as we move down that scale, you can see that perhaps SAP, for example, would be a bad choice because it would require lots of customization. ServiceNow does have a TBM module, but it's not very aligned to logic and customization. So we can see that there are some tools out there, but none of them fit quite nicely as the ones that are specifically designed for using as cost transparency modeling. So if we look at the steps that we need to take, there are 4 steps that we need to take when we start our TBM journey. The first one is the inception. So the CIO needs to drive the agenda. We need to identify our use cases. We need to gain access to the data that we will require, and we need to justify the investment in that project. Finance need to also provide cost pools and IT towers, so they will already have their costs in their financial systems. We need to work with the use cases. We need to obtain finance and HR information, so which projects are running, what labor is being used, what time is being spent on projects, perhaps what are our vendor contracts. And obviously we need to cost out any IT activities that are running in parallel to this project. Now, once we've obtained that operational data, we can allocate costs against servers, storage, tickets. We can allocate services to business units, and we can provide a total cost of consumption based on some of the applications. We can then look at driving demand, making sure that demand is where it's needed, and we can start looking at driving costs down. Once we've achieved that IT to business step, then we're looking at value creation. Now we can start to do chargeback and benchmarking. We can ensure that everybody adopts our processes, and we can focus on communication without the whole organization. So if we take a timeline of our 4 steps and we look at the journey that we would need to take, we start off with the inception. We then firstly map finance to IT. Once we've mapped finance to IT and we know our basic cost transparency across IT, we can then map IT to business, and then we can create that value creation that we use and roll out across the organization. We can adapt perhaps planning processes. We can initiate other projects. We can cost out other parts of the organization, and we can start to mature the IT value back to the business. So in conclusion, we can say that organizations can open that black box. Quite often we hear IT is a black hole. There's a black box of IT costs that go into the organization that aren't seen as value or coming out. We can engage in those value conversations with business. If we have the information and the data, it's quite easy to have conversations when we have data to back it and we know that that data is correct and up to date. We can make the right decisions and prepare the business for the future. Perhaps we look at some of the taxonomies within the TBM and we can say, what happens if we switch off this technology? How would that affect the business? How will that affect our costs? And in doing so, we're opening up that conversation between the CIO, the CFO, and the CEO, and that all must have an essential role in managing all of that technology and moving the organization forwards. So just wrapping up, there we go.